The smell of smoke burned Lila May's lungs before she even saw the fire. It was thick, acrid, curling into her throat like living black snakes. Her ragged shoes scuffed against the scorched wooden floorboards as she crept through the cabin, each step making the building groan and shudder. Flames licked the walls and ceiling, hungrily consuming everything in sight. The kitchen table warped and cracked. A row of dishes exploded into shards, and the pantry spilled its meager contents. In a chaotic tumble of charred beans and flour, shadows danced across the walls, twisting the furniture into monstrous shapes. She could hear the baby before she saw him, a small, terrified wail, trembling but persistent. It came from the corner near the back wall. Lila May's heart lurched in her chest. She had never cared about anyone but herself. The streets had been cruel, the adults mean, and kindness a luxury she'd never known. Yet the tiny face peering out from the crib, pale and scared, struck something deep inside her. A spark she didn't understand. "Hold still, little one," she whispered, her voice hoarse, rasping through the smoke. The baby's eyes were wide, glimmering with tears and fear, reflecting the dancing flames around them. Lila May hesitated, glancing toward the door. The fire was spreading faster than she'd imagined, the ceiling above sagging and creaking, threatening to collapse. But she couldn't leave him. Not now. She grabbed the edge of the crib, bracing her feet against the floorboards. The baby's tiny fists batted at her hands, weak and panicked. She lifted him with surprising strength, cradling him against her chest. His weight was slight, but it felt heavier than the world pressing down on her. The heat seared through her jacket, the flames hissing and snapping as she stepped backward. The cabin shivered around them, beams splitting and falling, sparks raining like deadly fireflies. A crash behind her made her heart leap. Part of the roof had collapsed, and smoke poured through the opening like a living thing. Lila May gagged, coughing violently, but pressed on. She had no clear plan, only a desperate, single-minded determination. Get out. The baby's small cries burrowed into her mind, demanding action. She stumbled through the doorway, the night air hitting her like a wave of ice. Outside, the darkness was both terrifying and familiar. The wind carried the scent of pine and dust, but it also brought the distant shouts of men neighbors, bounty hunters, maybe the baby's own kin. They would come for the child. They would come for her. Her boots sank into the dirt road as she ran, the baby tucked tightly against her chest. She passed a toppled wagon, its wheels smoldering. She ducked behind it, peering out at the distant glow of the burning cabin. It looked like a beacon, calling anyone with a score to settle. Shadows moved along the edges of the road, figures silhouetted against the inferno. Lila May swallowed hard. She wasn't fast and she wasn't strong, but she had grit. She had to have grit. The baby squirmed, tiny fists pressing against her neck. She murmured, rocking him gently as she ran. Her own throat burned with the smoke she'd swallowed. Her mind raced, searching for a plan. The creek was nearby. She could hide there. Or the abandoned barn on the edge of town. Though it was risky, empty structures could be traps, and the men in town didn't play fair. Every instinct screamed for her to run. Yet every instinct also warned her that she couldn't let the child go. A crackling sound above made her flinch. The fire was alive, prowling behind her, hungrily licking the edges of the doorway she had just left. Sparks landed on her shoulders, burning through the thin fabric of her jacket. The baby yelped at the heat, and Lila May swore under her breath, adjusting him in her arms. Her muscles ached from the tension, from the weight of responsibility she hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. Somewhere deep in her chest, a new feeling stirred fear, yes, but also something else. Responsibility, protection, a stubborn, unwilling kind of courage that made her push forward even when every part of her body screamed to turn back. She would save this baby, even if it cost her everything. And as she disappeared into the night, the burning cabin behind them, she didn't know if she was running toward safety or deeper into the jaws of danger. Either way, there was no turning back. By sunrise, the smoldering cabin was little more than a heap of blackened timber, smoke curling lazily into the pale morning sky. Lila May stood a few hundred yards away, the baby still clutched tightly against her chest. His soft cries had quieted to occasional whimpers, but the fear in his eyes remained. She wrapped him as best she could in her tattered shawl, pressing him close, and tried to think. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and yet she couldn't leave him behind. The dirt road stretched before her, lined with tumbleweeds and the faint footprints of townsfolk who had likely seen the flames. Rumors of her daring escape would spread quickly. She knew the baby wasn't hers. He was the child of someone she had every reason to consider an enemy, but something inside her refused to let him die. The world had been cruel to her. She knew its bitterness well. But letting an innocent child perish felt different, unbearable in a way she hadn't expected. Every sound made her flinch. Birds stirred in the morning light. The wind rustled through the sparse prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, the faint clatter of hooves sent a shiver down her spine. She ducked behind a toppled wagon, peering cautiously at the horizon. Figures moved in the distance, men, likely armed, likely searching for the child and the girl who had stolen him from the flames. Lila May swallowed hard, her throat dry, and hugged the baby tighter. "It's okay," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to soothe him or herself. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, her ragged coat, his pale cheeks, and the dirt road stretching ahead into uncertainty. She remembered the creek near the old mill, a place where townspeople rarely ventured. If she could reach it, she might find some cover among the reeds and rocks. With careful, deliberate steps, she made her way down a narrow path, keeping low and silent. Her heart pounded with every crack of a twig beneath her feet, every whisper of the wind that might carry her presence to her pursuers. Halfway to the creek, she paused, realizing how exhausted she had become. Her legs ached, her lungs burned from the smoke she had inhaled, and her stomach protested with sharp pangs of hunger. Yet giving up was not an option. She had saved the baby, and now she had to survive long enough to ensure his safety. The prairie seemed endless, a vast expanse of dirt and scrub, sun already climbing, making the earth and making every movement heavier. Then she heard them voices, harsh, angry, searching. She couldn't have gotten far, one called. "Check the creek." Another added, "Don't let her slip away with the brat." Lila May's blood ran cold. They were close. She pressed herself into a shallow ditch, her body trembling as the men's footsteps grew louder. The baby whimpered against her chest, his tiny warmth a comfort and a burden all at once. She held her breath as the men passed, barely a few feet away, scanning the prairie for any sign of movement. Her heart pounded like a drum in her ears, and she closed her eyes, silently praying they wouldn't look down. Minutes stretched like hours, the sun rising higher, until finally the voices faded. When she dared to move again, she didn't run straight to the creek. Instead, she ducked behind a cluster of rocks, dragging the baby with her. The water was only a few hundred yards away, glinting in the morning light like a ribbon of silver. If she could reach it, she might hide in the reeds, use the shadows, and miss to shield herself and the child. The thought of the men returning filled her with dread, but she also felt a new determination. She had faced fire and death just to save this baby. She could face more. Each step toward the creek was a gamble, each movement a small victory over fear. By the time she reached the water, Lila May's clothes were streaked with soot and dirt, her hair matted and damp from sweat. She lowered the baby gently to the grass, scanning the surroundings for any sign of the search party. For a moment, she allowed herself a small measure of relief. They were not safe, yet not by a long shot, but for now, they were hidden. As the morning light touched the prairie, Lila May realized something she hadn't before. She was no longer just surviving. She was protecting someone else. Someone who depended on her, and for the first time in her young life, she felt a flicker of courage bigger than fear. The baby's tiny hand reached for her, and she clasped it tightly, whispering again, "We'll be okay. I promise we'll be okay." But deep in the distance, beyond the glinting creek, the first signs of trouble were already gathering. The creek's cool water glinted like silver in the early morning light, and Lila May's sore legs carried her closer with desperate speed. She ducked behind a cluster of rocks and reeds, panting, her ragged clothes sticking to her back with it. Sweat and dirt. The baby's small whimpers reminded her of the urgency of her task. Every fiber of her being screamed that they weren't safe yet. The prairie seemed endless, and even here, the sound of hooves and distant voices reminded her that danger was never far behind. She found a small cave tucked into the riverbank, partly hidden by overhanging brush. It wasn't much damp earth. Musty smells and evidence that a raccoon or fox had once called it home, but had offered shelter. Carefully, she laid the baby on a makeshift bed of grass she had gathered. His tiny body shivered from exhaustion and fear. Lila May wrapped him tighter in her shawl, pressing her own warmth against him, willing the trembling to subside. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe. The wind whispered across the water, carrying scents of pine and wildflowers. Birds called in the distance, though even their songs felt distant and fragile against the threat that lingered everywhere. She listened intently, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the grass set her heart racing. She knew the men would not give up easily. They were relentless, angry, and armed. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of her hunger. She had eaten little more than scraps over the past few days, and the baby needed nourishment as well. Lila May scanned the creek and surrounding land, hoping to find something to eat or at least drink. The water was clear and cold, but she hesitated. Touching the baby's lips to the icy stream would startle him. She decided to wait, thinking of ways to calm him first. The baby's tiny hands clutched her fingers, and Lila May felt an unfamiliar surge of protectiveness. She had never known responsibility like this before. In the streets, survival had meant looking out for herself, stealing scraps of food, avoiding adults and other children alike. But now, a tiny life depended entirely on her. The thought made her chest tighten and her resolve harden. Hours passed slowly. Lila May stayed in the cave, using her body as a shield against the outside world. She hummed softly to the baby, a tune she remembered from her childhood, hoping to soothe him. His eyelids grew heavy, and soon the sound of steady breathing filled the small space. She allowed herself a brief moment of relief, for now they were safe, but the danger was not gone. Lila May could sense it, a low, simmering presence beyond. The creek, beyond the canyon. The prairie was wide, but men could track them if they tried. Every instinct she had screamed to keep moving, yet moving during the day was riskier. She needed a plan, a way to reach somewhere truly safe. Somewhere far from the townsfolk and the angry voices that hunted her. As the sun rose higher, she scanned the horizon through a narrow opening in the cave. Dusty trails in the distance hinted at wagon tracks, footprints, and perhaps the approach of horses. The prairie was beautiful in its wild, untamed way, but it was a dangerous beauty, offering no shelter except for the small cave she now occupied. She pressed herself against the damp earth, listening, waiting, hoping. Night fell again, and with it came new sounds. Coyotes called in the distance, their howls eerie and sharp. Wind rustled the grass, carrying faint scents, horses, smoke, and something she couldn't quite identify. The baby stirred, whimpering softly. Lila May stroked his head gently, whispering reassurance she wasn't even sure she believed herself. Every sound of the wilderness was a reminder that they were outsiders here, vulnerable and alone. Yet in that vulnerability, a quiet strength began to grow inside her. She had faced fire and men, the raw, unforgiving dangers of the prairie, and she had survived. She had saved the baby, even when it seemed impossible. Now they had a temporary refuge, a small measure of safety. And for the first time, Lila May felt something she hadn't known in years, hope. But hope, she reminded herself, was fragile. Tomorrow the townsfolk would continue their search, and the world outside the cave was still full of threats. She tightened her hold on the baby, pressing his tiny body to hers. No matter what came, she would face it. They would face it together. By the time Lila May dared to emerge from the cave, the morning sun had climbed high, painting the prairie in harsh gold and dust. The creek shimmered beneath the heat, but the sense of danger hung heavier than the summer air. She adjusted the baby in her arms, his tiny body warm against hers, and squinted toward the horizon. Smoke still rose faintly from the ruins of the cabin, a grim reminder of the night's fire. She had saved him, yes, but she had also made herself a target. Word traveled fast in the townsfolk's gossip-fueled world. By midday, notices were nailed to every saloon door, every wagon post. A crude sketch of a ragged girl clutching a baby. Bold letters warning all who saw her, reward for capture. Lila May's stomach churned at the thought. Men, armed and angry, would hunt her across the plains. Their wrath wasn't just for the baby. It was for defiance, for daring to interfere. With a world that demanded obedience, her legs ached from the cave, the creek, and the constant vigilance. Her body screamed for rest, yet she couldn't afford to linger. Every shadow in the tall grass seemed alive. Every gust of wind carried the possibility of discovery. Lila May pressed herself low, moving carefully between rocks and shrubs, her eyes darting to the distant town where smoke rose faintly like a warning finger. She could hear the murmurs of horses and men in the distance, and panic clawed at her chest. The prairie, which had felt so vast and open, now seemed a trap. Each step might be the one that revealed her location. Her grip on the baby tightened instinctively. He stirred, tiny hands clutching her ragged coat, his face buried in her neck. She whispered softly, trying to soothe him and herself, though her words felt fragile in the vast, hostile land. As she approached a narrow path leading to a stand of scrubby trees, voices rose in the distance, harsh, accusing, commanding. There, behind that rock. Don't let her get away with that brat. Lila May's pulse skyrocketed. She ducked behind a boulder, heart hammering against her ribs, as the men's boots and the pounding hooves of their horses drew nearer. She prayed they wouldn't see her, that luck or some miracle would keep them blind to her presence. Time seemed to stretch. Dust swirled in the wind, clinging to her sweaty skin and the baby's soft hair. She could hear their shouts, the creak of saddles, the clatter of hooves, each sound a drumbeat of terror. The baby whimpered, and Lila May's resolve hardened. She would not let them take him. He was alive because of her. She owed him protection, no matter what. The men passed by the boulder, voices growing fainter. Lila May exhaled slowly, feeling a temporary wave of relief. But relief was dangerous. In this land, one mistake, one careless glance, and the wrath of the town would descend on her like a storm. She couldn't run blindly. She needed a plan, a place where even the sharpest eyes couldn't reach them. She led the baby through a narrow trail lined with thorny brush, careful to avoid leaving footprints in the dirt. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the prairie stretched on endlessly. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, sweat stung her eyes, but she ignored it. Survival demanded focus, not distraction. Hours passed, and shadows shifted with the sun's arc. Layla. May spotted an abandoned barn in the distance, its boards warped and weathered, roof partially caved in. It was a gamble. Empty buildings were unpredictable, often hiding danger, but it offered cover and perhaps a chance to rest without being visible from the main road. She moved cautiously, keeping low, and reached the barn as the afternoon heat intensified. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of hay, but it felt safe compared to the open prairie. She laid the baby down on a small pile of straw, brushing dirt from his cheek. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax, letting the fear and tension ebb slightly. He was asleep now, peaceful in her care, and for that brief hour, they were safe. Yet even in this small refuge, Lila May knew they weren't free. The town would not stop, and the men hunting her would continue until they found her. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the baby's steady heartbeat beneath her palm, and whispered, "I won't let them take you. I promise." Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, the sun's glare unforgiving, the wind whispering of dangers still to come. And Lila May, ragged, determined, and weary beyond her years, prepared herself for the challenges that awaited. Wrath of the town, the relentless pursuit, and the unknown trials of the wide, untamed Old West. The sun dipped low over the prairie, casting long, jagged shadows across the dirt road as Lila May led the baby through the scrub and sparse trees. Her clothes were stained with dust and sweat, her hair matted, her legs trembling from exhaustion. Every sense was on high alert, the rustle of grass, the distant clatter of hooves, even the cries of birds overhead seemed like warnings. Somewhere behind her, the men were still searching, relentless and determined, eager to reclaim the child she had saved. She paused at the crest of a small hill, scanning the horizon. The prairie stretched endlessly, golden and harsh under the dying sunlight. She felt the weight of the baby in her arms, soft and fragile against her chest, and a wave of responsibility settled heavy on her shoulders. She had risked everything to save him. She would not let him be taken now. And then she saw him dot at the edge of the town square. A shadow detached itself from the gathering crowd. Tall, imposing, his silhouette cutting a striking figure against the warm, fading light. A man, broad-shouldered, with long, dark hair flowing past his shoulders and bronze skin weathered by the relentless sun. He wore simple but strong clothing, adorned with tribal jewelry that caught the last glimmers of daylight. There was an air of authority in his posture, a silent command that made even the men in the square pause. Lila May froze. The man's eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and calculating, until they locked on her. He didn't move hastily or shout, but something in his gaze told her he understood the danger she faced and perhaps the reason behind it. He didn't need words. She could feel the promise of protection emanating from him, a quiet but undeniable force that cut through the tension like a blade. The townsfolk hesitated. Murmurs spread through the crowd as men glanced at each other, uncertainty creeping into their eyes. The warrior man stepped forward, his presence alone enough to command attention. "Step back," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority. No one moved. The wind swept across the square, carrying the faint scent of earth and leather, and the men's hands twitched near their rifles. Yet still, they did not advance. Lila May's heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen anyone like him before. Not a man of the law, not a bounty hunter, not even the cold, cruel faces of townsfolk. There was a strength in him, something primal and protective, a silent promise that danger would not reach her, not if he could prevent it. She dared to breathe a little easier, though fear still lingered at the edges of her mind. The man's gaze returned to the baby, who wriggled slightly in her arms. He nodded once, slowly, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the child's safety as if he had known all along that this small life mattered. Lila May felt a flicker of hope, fragile but alive. Without another word, the warrior man began to move, a fluid, controlled motion that suggested he was ready for anything. Lila May instinctively followed, keeping the baby close. They moved through the shadows of the prairie, slipping past the outskirts of town with a caution that only heightened the tension. Every step was deliberate, every glance a reminder that the men might still be watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike dead as they made their way toward a stand of trees that might offer shelter. Lila May allowed herself a small, tentative smile. For the first time since that burning cabin, she felt a sense of possibility. They were not free of danger, but now she had an ally, a formidable, mysterious figure whose presence alone seemed to shift the balance in their favor. The prairie stretched before them, wild and untamed, but with the warrior man by her side. Lila May felt a new kind of courage rising within her. She could face what came next, step by step, with the fragile hope that they might survive the wrath of the town and find safety beyond the horizon. For the first time, she realized that she was no longer alone, and that, perhaps, was enough to keep running. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, golden in the late afternoon sun, yet it offered little comfort. Lila May's legs ached, her lungs burned with every step, and the baby's soft whimpers reminded her that they were far from safe. Behind them, the distant sound of hooves and shouts echoed across the dry plains. The townsfolk were relentless, and every passing minute felt like a trap closing in. The warrior man moved ahead of her, his presence a shield against the chaos. Shirtless and muscular, with long black hair whipping in the wind and tribal jewelry glinting on his bronze skin, he exuded a quiet authority. Each step he took was precise, controlled, as if the earth itself bent to his command. The townsfolk hesitated at the edge of the prairie, uncertain how to face him. Giving Lila May the fraction of time she needed to keep moving, she pressed the baby closer to her chest, his warmth a fragile comfort against the harsh landscape. "We're almost safe," she whispered, though the words felt fragile, even to her own ears. Every rustle in the tall grass, every distant shout, made her heart leap. She could feel the relentless gaze of the men behind them, eager to reclaim what they considered theirs. The warrior man glanced back, his sharp eyes catching every shadow, every movement. Without a word, he signaled for her to follow a narrow path that led toward a stand of rocks and low trees. The terrain was uneven and treacherous, but it offered the best chance to evade pursuit. Lila May stumbled but kept moving, trusting him, trusting the strength radiating from his presence. Suddenly, a group of mounted men appeared on a ridge, silhouetted against the setting sun. They raised their rifles, shouting threats, but the warrior man did not falter. He stepped forward, chest bare, muscles taut and gleaming, his eyes locked on the approaching hunters. A low, commanding voice carried across the wind, "Stop!" The words were not a request, they were a warning, and in that instant the men froze, caught off guard by the sheer force of his presence. Lila May's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen such power, such unwavering authority. The warrior man turned, his eyes meeting hers, and gave a subtle nod. "Move." She hurried along the rocky path, careful not to trip, keeping the baby secure. Behind her, the men hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The path narrowed, funneling them between rocks that jutted from the earth like the spines of ancient beasts. The baby stirred, whimpering, and Lila May whispered soothing words, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. The warrior man slowed, allowing her to catch up, and placed a protective hand near her shoulder, guiding them both with silent authority. The sun dipped lower, painting the prairie in fiery reds and golds, shadows stretching long across the land. Lila May spotted a small canyon ahead, its cliffs rising like natural walls, concealing a narrow passage. If they could reach it, they might find true cover, a place where the townsfolk could not follow easily. Every step toward that canyon was a battle against fatigue, against fear, against the relentless sun that drained her strength. The men behind them shouted again, frustration and anger breaking through, but the warrior man's presence was an unspoken barrier. One glance from him was enough to make even the bravest hesitate. He gestured silently toward the canyon, and Lila May understood. With renewed determination, she pressed on, moving faster, driven by hope and desperation. At last, they reached the canyon's edge. The rocky walls rose steeply, offering shadow and concealment. Lila May lowered the baby gently onto a patch of soft grass hidden from view, brushing dirt from his clothes. She exhaled, feeling a rare moment of relief wash over her. For now they were out of immediate danger. The warrior man stood at the canyon entrance, scanning the horizon. His muscles gleamed in the fading light, and his eyes were sharp, vigilant. "We'll rest here," he said quietly, his voice steady. "For now, they cannot reach us." Lila May nodded, clutching the baby close, her chest still racing from the relentless chase. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel a small measure of safety. The prairie, wild and unforgiving, still stretched endlessly around them. But with the warrior man beside her, she felt courage she had never known. They had survived the fire, the hunt, and the wrath of the town. Now in the canyon's shelter, she realized something extraordinary. They might just survive what came next, together. Night had fallen over the canyon, the prairie beyond swallowed by darkness. The stars twinkled coldly in the vast sky, a reminder of the endless wilderness surrounding them. Lila May huddled against the warrior man's broad frame, the baby sleeping soundly in her arms. His steady breath was a small comfort in the tension that still gripped her heart. For hours they had remained hidden, every sound beyond the canyon walls keeping her on edge. The townsfolk had not pursued them into the canyon. Their shouts and hooves had faded into the distance hours ago, leaving only the whisper of wind through the rocks. Lila May exhaled slowly, pressing the baby closer. "We made it. We made it," she whispered, though her voice was raw from fear and exhaustion. The warrior man's eyes scanned the shadows, alert as always, but even his posture had softened slightly. He glanced at her, a faint nod acknowledging her bravery. "You did well," he said, his voice calm, steady, and reassuring. "He is safe because of you." Lila May's chest swelled with an unfamiliar mix of pride and relief. She had always survived on her own, scraping through the harsh streets, but now she realized that saving someone else protecting, someone innocent carried a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The warrior man gestured toward a narrow passage in the canyon that led to a hidden creek. "We can rest there," he said. "The water will wash away the dust and soot. You need strength." Lila May moved carefully, the baby still cradled in her arms. The canyon walls rose high on either side, shielding them from view, and the soft sound of running water promised a moment of safety. By the creek, the air was cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Lila May gently lowered the baby to a patch of grass near the water's edge, washing his tiny hands and face with trembling fingers. He cooed softly, comforted by the cool water and the soothing sounds of the night. For a moment, the harsh reality of the prairie, the fire, and the relentless pursuit faded into a fragile sense of peace. The warrior man sat nearby, shirtless and powerful in the moonlight, his long black hair falling across his shoulders. The tribal jewelry he wore glinted faintly, catching the light of the stars. He seemed at once fierce and protective, a silent sentinel who had brought them through danger when survival had seemed impossible. Lila May felt a deep gratitude, mixed with awe, for the strength and courage he had shown, not just for her, but for the baby whose life hung in the balance. Hours passed in quiet. The baby slept, and Lila May leaned against the warrior man, feeling an odd sense of safety she had never known. Her heart, once hardened by life on the streets, began to soften, realizing that courage, kindness, and protection could exist even in the harshest of worlds. She looked at the warrior man, eyes meeting his, and understood without words that they shared a bond forged in fire, danger, and survival. Morning approached slowly, the first light of dawn spilling over the canyon walls. Lila May gently woke. The baby, who stirred, blinking against the soft glow of the sun. The warrior man stood, muscles rippling as he stretched, scanning the horizon. "We must move carefully," he said. "The town may still search, but the canyon will give us time to find a safe place." Lila May nodded, gathering the baby in her arms. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that they could survive beyond the prairie, beyond the wrath of the town. Together, she and the warrior man began walking toward the hidden paths that wound through the canyon. Each step was cautious, deliberate, but filled with hope. As they disappeared into the shadows of the canyon, Lila May realized that her life had changed forever. She had faced fire, fear, and the relentless cruelty of men, but she had also discovered courage, protection, and the strength to care for another life. The warrior man walked beside her, silent but unwavering, a guardian in a world that had offered little kindness. For Lila May, the baby and the warrior man, the prairie still stretched endlessly, wild and unpredictable. But they had each other, and for the first time, that was enough. Safety, fleeting but real, had finally found them. And as the sun rose higher, painting the canyon walls in golden light, a fragile peace settled over the small trio, a promise that, despite the dangers of the world, they had survived together.